Bienvenidos a Mercado 369. Thank you for being here at Mercado 369. We are so proud that Texas Tribune has selected our space to do the first of a series of discussions about topics that are relevant to our community in particular, but all communities within the state of Texas. Mercado opened in November of last year, and since then, we've been really fortunate that this space has become a meeting place for a myriad of different community events and organizations that have found this to be a welcoming and warm environment to be able to express ideas that affect us all in different aspects. And one of the ways that we're trying to communicate particularly the Latino culture and the history that we have is through art and artisans that we represent from Mexico to Argentina. We do the Americas, and in our programming, what we're trying to provide is an understanding of how art and through the culture that we find in our art is a way that we can open up discourse and conversations and find the similarities that we have between all the communities and not just the Latino communities. So we're doing this in a lot of different ways, but one is that we're specifically going to the communities and directly into the artisans that we're meeting and going to their workshops and watching them perform the artwork that they've been doing sometimes for 4 and 5 generations, and try to get a better understanding of how culturally it makes their society, their community stronger to be able to continue in these art forms. But what we're doing is we're bringing them to Dallas and specifically to Oak Cliff. We're bringing them on the second Saturday of each month in workshops that are free to the community, and they bring their wares and understanding of how to communicate why these art pieces and art forms are important for them, and how these traditions are ones that they're continuing to bring. So we have a large audience usually on those Saturdays from 5 to 95, and welcome everyone that's here today to come back and enjoy those workshops as well. One of the things that we're really proud of is that as we opened the space, we didn't really know what direction it was taking, and a few months into it, we realized that meetings like today are much needed, and there hasn't been a space to provide these type of discourses. And so reaching full throttle to almost a year opening and having the Texas Tribune here, I think is a testament that our message is getting across, that there is a need and this is a space for all of the community. One of the things that we're really most proud of is that our association and providing this space with Texas Tribune is that their commitment, and we're all in need for news, but we're all in need of accurate news, and we need information that's provided to us so that we're readily able to make decisions, based on the facts and not on facts that are weighted with one direction or another. And so the Texas Tribune, history and policy of that going on its 10th year makes it even more important for us to have this association here. But one of the areas that we're really most excited about supporting the Texas Tribune is the direction it's taking these type of events directly into the community. Like our community in Oak Cliff, that the issue of housing is of paramount importance. We see here between the 4 blocks between here and Davis or Bishop Arts, there's been a lot of displaced community. And so there's not a lot of conversation that's taking place on a public level like this. And so we really welcome the opportunity for the discussion from the community to get ideas on how we can get ideas to promote business so that we can create jobs, but also at the same time maintain our neighborhoods and maintain the space that we know and what attracts people to this area in the first place. That's why with our artwork, a lot of times we get asked, why didn't we build this gallery space in North Dallas? Because that's where it seems obvious that the clientele would be. And really our response is one that, we're in the heart of Oak Cliff. on Jefferson Boulevard. We have the banners that we've placed along the last, the first 3 blocks in front of Mercado, welcoming to Oak Cliff. Our idea is to bring those people to Oak Cliff and not us to across the river. So, and we've been really successful in a lot of events that we've had in bringing people to Oak Cliff that have either never been here, they've been in Dallas all their lives, or they haven't been here for 10 or 15 years. So we understand the changes are taking place, and there's a lot of people feeling displaced, a lot of people feeling not sure of what the direction it's going. So that's why we wanted to stake a claim right here in the middle of Oak Cliff on Jefferson Boulevard, which is the heart, and understanding why we're here and why it's important that we're here. And I think the discussions that hopefully will come from today are what's going to stay with us. The format will be that we'll have a discussion and with action plans that will go into place so that the work with these toolkits will continue on and we'll be able to have the effects of it. But we have a busy program today, so I'll stop at that. I just wanted to thank you again for being here on behalf of all of us at the Mercado 369 team that have worked to make you feel comfortable. The team is all around you. If you have questions afterwards, we'll be here to answer those. And please think of Mercado 369 when you have events in the future. Thank you for being here.
I also want to thank everyone for being here. My name is Brandon Formby. I'm the urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune. I'm also the Tribune's only Dallas-based reporter. I'm very excited to have this event in Dallas. Just want to thank Jorge for hosting this, and we also want to thank Diana Martinez and Tino Jaramillo for their help in organizing the event. And we want to thank our sponsors for tonight's panel, the Texas Association of Realtors, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Dallas Women's Foundation, the Simmons Foundation, United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, and the Foundation for Minority Interests in Media. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they have no say or influence over our panelists or the content of the actual events. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization, and to become a member, you can see Sarah at the check-in desk at the front. This is going to last, the panel is going to last until 7:30, and that will include about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A for the panelists from y'all. There will be a microphone where y'all can ask questions once we're done having our little chat. And if you could, please silence your cell phones. And if you do want to tweet the event, we ask that you use the hashtag #TTEvents. And with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. To my left, I have Christy Myers, who is the Managing Director of Opportunity Dallas. That's a nonprofit focusing on economic mobility and prosperity. Before that, she was General Manager of the Mayor's Neighbor Up Dallas organization, which focused on growth in the city's education corridor. To her left is Monty Anderson. He is the CEO and president of Options Real Estate Investments, which specializes in developments in southern Dallas County and northern Ellis County. And directly to his left is Miguel Solis. He is a Dallas Independent School District trustee, president of the Latino Center for Leadership Development. He's also the youngest person ever elected to the DISD board and the youngest person to ever serve as the board's president. So with that, let's just go ahead and dig in. In Texas, a lot of times we hear...
And that's Siri.
Thank you, Siri. In Texas, we, especially at the state level, we hear, elected officials talk about the Texas miracle and how, the economy is doing so great. So many people want to live here. We have so much, unbridled growth, especially in the urban areas. Because it's relatively affordable to live here. But once you actually start drilling down, into what's going on in the cities, especially in Dallas, you kind of see a different picture. Dallas's median income is lower than the state median income. We have 60% of people are renters. Roughly 6/10 of those renters are cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. I kind of want to just ask each of you to start off is what do you kind of see as the disconnect, between bragging about how great Texas is doing and what people are actually actual Texans are experiencing on the ground?
Okay. So I will start this with saying I'm not originally from Dallas. I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan. And one of the things about Dallas, short of going like this on a map, and it was the closest big city and it's warmer than Michigan in the winters, was that it was seen as a land of opportunity. And there's a lot of different things you can come to Dallas and you can do. And I had a job offer before I was even in the state of Texas or even a resident of the state of Texas. And that was with the Dallas Regional Chamber. And after a couple of years with the Dallas Regional Chamber, I then went and worked for Dallas ISD. And in that time, we started a program called the Mayor's Rising Star Council. And the short of this is that in the beginning of starting that, which was targeted to 5 Southern Dallas high schools and high school students, we asked them, what is downtown Dallas to you? What is Dallas to you? And we had the same answers from every single one of the kids of, this is not a land of opportunity. This is not a city that was made for us who was born and raised here. And we don't want to come back here because of what it is that we have had growing up in this. And so that, to me, was really telling. And especially we go, all of us in this room go around to other cities across the country and get asked that question of, oh, Dallas is so great. And it is, but there is this large gap that is really not, until recently, talked about a whole lot. And I think it behooves us not to recognize it, but I do think conversations like this, and especially our elected officials, Miguel is leading this and talking about this from a district level and exposing it across the city. So I think that's important to recognize.
Well, let's see. In southern Dallas County, basically we have a city of two halves. We have the haves in the north and the have-nots in the south. It's been that way my whole life. And I want to give you it just went on. I just got back from Detroit, Michigan, and in 1950, Detroit, Michigan was the richest city in the world. Was the richest city in the world. And today, recently it's bankrupt. And it's because of a similar situation. So right here in Dallas right now, for instance, we're concentrating on building a deck park over I-35 when we can't even fix the sidewalks and the parks or clean the places up south of there that are connected to there. So we're always looking for the big shiny projects, the big silver bullet projects, and yet we let the poor in Dallas get poorer and poorer. In fact, most people don't know it, but we have some of the highest poverty in the country, right here in some of the southern Dallas neighborhoods. And until we realize that the links of the chain are all connected and that we're only as good as that weakest link, we're never going to be a great city. We may have some shiny bridges and some big buildings and some art museums and things like that, but what do you have? What do you have in these poor neighborhoods? And we talk about jobs. I'm just tired of hearing about jobs. What I want to hear about is entrepreneurs and wealth building, and I want to hear about people owning property in South Dallas in their own neighborhoods instead of getting pushed out as the development comes from the north, to the south. So I mean, we have to intentionally do this. Our policies are really set up in Dallas, and financing and capital and money is set up where to actually fail. In fact, if you're poor or you're lower middle class, you pay high interest rates for money. And when the opposite ought to be true, we ought to have the low interest for that money. And I don't believe in the giveaways, but I do believe that we should have the access to capital, and we need to do much better job. And then not only do we have to get the capital, but there has to be an ongoing mentoring program forever. You can't just throw somebody out there into the forest and not give them a rope to come back. And so we have to do a much more intentional job of helping people lift themselves up.
So You know, it is hard to a degree to disagree with the basic premise that Texas is thriving when it comes to an economic standpoint. I mean, the baseline numbers will show you that that is indeed the case. But when you dig a little deeper and you start looking at the policies that allow for something like this, and to go a step further, the politics that allow for something like this, you then begin to uncover some pretty startling facts and some pretty startling realities. And that is, this miracle has been cut on the backs of working class people and lower income people. And because of that reality, you are then faced with the reality that you just heard from Christy and from Monty, and that is, we are facing big crises related to things like housing and education and so on and so forth for a growing segment of our communities across the state of Texas. And then what ultimately ends up happening is we've now found ourselves with an even bigger, more existential problem. And that is, there's a lot of people that are buying into this baseline idea that the Texas miracle is happening, and we are seeing something called reurbanization, where we've got people that are moving back into the cores because they hear that's where the hottest action is. They're now faced with an affordability crisis, but we can't forget about the true affordability crisis that was always there and never left, and that is affordable housing for people who have lived here for forever, that never had the opportunity to leave to go anywhere else. So yes, to a degree, the Texas miracle is a real thing, but when you start to uncover how it became a real thing, that's where the real conversation and transformational change, in my opinion, has to happen.
We did a story last year based off of a report from Harvard that dug into, cities all across the nation. And one of the, and this is kind of economics 101, one of the biggest reasons you're seeing, or people are having more difficulty finding a place that's affordable for them, and this is people like up and down the socioeconomic spectrum, is just housing costs are outpacing income so much. And Monty, as a developer, I kind of wanted to ask you, what is it that makes it, what are the barriers for developers that make it difficult for them to build housing that is affordable, for people who make 80% the area median income or 60%?
Well, one of the biggest barriers is, being able to build small. I believe that everybody deserves quality. If you're poor, you just have small, but it still should be quality. And our policies really here don't allow that. And nobody wants those small places built, and they don't want alternative housing. They don't want accessory dwelling units built onto their house. So if you had an accessory dwelling unit built onto an affluent house, it could be at a lower rent, but you can't. There's been a big conversation about that until just recently. You hadn't even been able to do that. And so we're not building the right things that house people. In other words, we just designed a house that was a 1,200 square foot house for a family of 5. And then we put sleeper cells for the 5 kids in the attic so they could actually live in an area that was more affluent. And we're not mixing the neighborhoods good. We're still very segregated. But we're just not segregated, by race. We're segregated by economics. And we just don't allow the right kinds of things that allow us to do the affordable places. In the old days, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, would have 2 units above their shop or in the back, and the butcher could lease to the busboy down the street, or the single teacher, or the elderly female a nurse, that's single. And so we just don't have those kind of places, and our policy doesn't encourage that and doesn't allow it in most cases. And so therefore developers react by profit, and therefore it doesn't get done.
That kind of brings me to the Dallas City Council earlier this year passed its first comprehensive housing policy, and one of the tenets of that was to focus on 3 different types of areas in Dallas. Redevelopment areas, which is where, a project has started or is about to start that's, going to lead to change there. Stabilization areas where redevelopment is, already happening and it's starting to threaten, low-income residents who live there. And then what they call emerging markets, which are areas that need, a lot of help with infrastructure, code enforcement, crime deterrence. What are y'all's thoughts on this policy? Does it go, is it a step in the right direction? Does it go far enough? Does it go too far? Do y'all think it will really help to, start to stem some of these problems in Dallas? I'll start with you, Miguel, and then we can come back this way.
So I would first say that prior to this comprehensive housing policy, technically, there was not a housing policy in the city of Dallas. Now, I say technically because there was sort of a housing policy, and it was basically market-driven, and it was basically make sure that you comply with, federal regulations from a HUD standpoint. And there's questions about still whether or not that completely happened. But you follow what the feds say you have to do, and then you let the market dictate what housing should look like across our city. And what did that lead to? That led to the inability to afford, unaffordability, gentrification, that led to sweetheart deals, and so on and so forth. And so we had a housing policy, but to whom's benefit? So I want to first give kudos to the city council and our new city manager for saying this is an issue, and it's an issue that we need to directly address. And so moving forward, the question now becomes, what are they getting right? What do they need to be held accountable to, and what can we build on? And I still think that there are areas that we can build on, particularly 4 major areas, and that's ensuring that now that they've got this market value analysis, which is really revolutionary, and it allows people to just go on a website and you can see what the market looks like across the city. But now that you've got that and you can identify where gentrification is happening, how do you ensure that that development, which can be a good thing, is inclusive? It includes everyone, including the people that are currently living in that developing area. The second thing would be making sure that we have a significant increase in affordable housing stock. And Monty already talked about one of the unique elements of this policy, these accessory dwelling units, which is a unique and innovative approach to allow for housing stock, affordable housing stock to exist in areas of high opportunity, which is area number 3, making sure that we can get people into areas of high opportunity. And then lastly, making sure that we don't give up on communities who have been left out of this equation for years. So trying to work on holistically revitalizing neighborhoods that currently have a hyper-concentration of poverty and a hyper-concentration of low-income housing tax credits, making sure that they don't get left behind as well. So there are a whole host of things embedded in those 4 areas that I just talked about that I think the council can work on. It will be an iterative process, but we should at least say, for the first time in the history of our city, and really in a unique way when it comes to large urban cities across the nation, we have a comprehensive housing policy.
So, and when you think about it, when you think about a neighborhood like Oak Cliff and what's happened over here, see, what we think about in solving the housing problem is giving a big developer a bunch of money to come over here and build us some apartments so we can stay tenants and we can stay leasers. And so I think that's a really backwards policy, because what happens is the big developer comes in the community, the big developer rents their project out, and they sell it to the Ohio State Teacher Pension Fund, okay, and they're gone. So they come in and get the money and go. So what if we did this? And I like to call it gentrification instead of gentrification, because gentrification is where the locals own properties, where they actually own them. But if you're poor, you pay higher money, you pay more for your loans. So we got to have cheap money for the people so they can own properties. So when the gentrification does come through, at least you don't have to sell, and if you do want to sell, you at least get rich and move to the next place. And see, we don't have that. And the key is building wealth. We're not building wealth. We're not teaching people how to fish. We just give some fish out once in a while and think we're doing a good job. And so we've got to we had cheap money for people that are entry levels and owning home. And then you can't just give them the home and as somebody that's never owned a property without assistance after that. And that's Habitat's problem. Our Habitat here does a very good job. They get you ready, get you a house, get you in, and then they dump you. And so you don't know how to keep up the house. You don't know how to keep it maintained, and then it just continues to deteriorate. And so we have to do a much better job of teaching and actually creating business owners, not jobs. We need more business owners. Every time we create an entrepreneur, we get like 3 jobs. Every time we create a job, we get 1 job. So we have to concentrate on the problem, not the symptom of the problem.
We'll see.
Okay.
So I think both of what they just said is right, and Miguel is right in saying that it is worth a hand clap that the city did adopt a comprehensive housing policy. There are a lot of shifts that need to happen. For those of you who nerd out every Monday and Wednesday and watch council committees and council meetings and heard even last Wednesday's discussion about a potential shift of what may or may not need to be amended in the housing policy, I think that it's healthy to have that discussion. We may not always agree with where the council ends at 5 or 6 p.m. that day, but it's a healthy conversation to have that's at least being had. The thing that I am cautious about is that there is a lot of opportunities around those big circles that have been drawn on the map. And I get concerned that if a new developer comes into some of these areas and does it the same way that it's always been done, all we actually done is highlighted and circled the areas for the next gentrification to take place, which is my most severe concern, because I had asked a question recently to some of the folks working hard on this at the city of, well, what do you tell Miss Betty if her home, if all she saw was in the newspaper that her home in her neighborhood is circled? That matters a whole lot, especially as this thing gets deployed, and that it doesn't get deployed in the same way it always has get done, and that we are keeping the community at mind. One of the projects that we recently worked on, that's being worked on in Southern Dallas by UNC Dallas, it may or may not ever happen, but one of the things that the developer said was, well, there's no way that this that this neighborhood wants any affordable market rate housing. And so we said, okay, well, we'll prove that they do. And so we put 70 people in a room, and I have to thank Chris Keith, who's sitting in the back, who's an advocate for this. And sure enough, the whole entire room of residents in that neighborhood said, yes, that's what we want too, but it's just presumed that we don't, and that we don't want to own our own homes. And so it's just this balance and this continued balance of, yes, we've adopted a policy, we've colored a circle around some targeted areas, but what are we really going to do differently? And how are we, as people sitting in this room, going to keep our policyholders accountable for that?
When people talk about housing affordability and how much housing costs, they think of things like rent or mortgage, maintenance, insurance, things like that. What's not talked about a lot is transportation costs. And there's just now starting to kind of be this awareness that, when you want to figure out how affordable a place is, you need to factor in transportation costs with that. Chrissy, I'll ask you this. Why do you think that, that's often ignored, and what are kind of, once you do start figuring transportation costs in, what kind of, differences do you see in what is actually affordable and unaffordable?
And it's important to mention that cost in this instance is time also. And so some of you may know, but I thought it was a really good idea to go start taking DART every day from downtown into Southern Dallas, specifically down into Paul Quinn, into the education corridor, and start writing about the absolute saga that it is to get from point A to point B on our current public transit system. And so once you start digging into some of that policy, there's not any transit policy currently that caps what our ride time is in comparison to what our drive time is. So what does that mean? For me to get from downtown to Paul Quinn College, which for any of you who have not visited or have been, they have an amazing work-study program. The kids are in internships, they're in jobs, an amazing program. Well, they have to get there somehow. And so right now they're having to pay these crazy Uber costs because I can get there in 13 to 16 minutes if I'm driving, and it's an hour and 27 minutes if I'm taking public transit. Not to mention the grass and the non-sidewalks and to get from point A to point B. But when then you're talking about a single mom who's trying to, I have some flexibility in my career to not have to arrive at 9 a.m. and not get fired. There are a lot of jobs who often are taken by transit-dependent neighbors who don't have that luxury, and if it's 9:30 because they had to catch the bus and then a train and then another train and somewhere in there get their kids to school, it's mind-boggling to me that there's not a greater focus on the transit. Because if you even look at our local transit agency's mission statement, it is to move transit-dependent people. I just think it might be missing a word, efficiently, or a thing of that nature, but stop there.
Miguel, the way that government is organized, I mean, so the state, basically has very little control over land use. That's left to the cities. But for now. Probably for a little while longer. But education is done by independent school districts. What kind of that siloing of government functions? I mean, does that make, as a school trustee who has very little control over who lives in your district, both like your district within the school district and the school district as a whole, what kind of challenges does that pose for y'all? And are there things that you need from the city or you would like from the city that you're not getting?
It is a great question, and literally what I was just about to say as I was listening to Christy talk. I mean, the first thing that I think it's really important we highlight is that we have, in some ways, siloed our way into these problems as well. Every municipal institution believes that they have a role, a responsibility, a mission, and a vision for their entity, and then if you're an elected, if you have electeds that are a part of your institution as well, then it's sort of a power thing, right? Like, this is what we do, and do not step on our toes. Let us do what we need to do. Well, we've got to completely transform that paradigm into recognizing that housing policy is actually education policy, right? Transportation policy is actually education policy, and vice versa. We today in the city of Dallas, from a DIC standpoint, are more segregated from a school system standpoint than we were 40 years ago. And one of the biggest drivers of that conundrum was housing. And really the role that governments played at the federal, at the state, and at the local level very strategically in creating a set of decisions and a set of policies to socially engineer where we're at today. So for me, it is very difficult to have to deal with the sins of the past. But I recognize that, and I recognize that a lot of that was rooted in race and racism, and I know that we need to do something completely different. As institutions, we should be working together towards a set of shared goals that help improve all of these systems, but also ensure that policies are in place that allow these institutions to talk to each other much more effectively. One of the biggest issues we face right now in trying to integrate our schools is transportation. There are, believe it or not, some families of privilege in the north of I-30, that want to send their kids to schools in the southern sector. I think about schools like Barack Obama Male Leadership Academy and others. But some of them just don't want to put their kids on buses and send them all the way down and have them come all the way back, because the kids have to wake up at 5 in the morning, get on a bus at 6 a.m., and they don't come home till 7 p.m. And the same is true of families in the southern sector who would love to send their kids to some of these new innovative schools in the north. But because we don't have a transportation system that allows for that to happen efficiently, both within DISD and outside through DART, and because we haven't created an effective housing situation where we could have the integration of communities, we're left with these problems. They're not they can be overcome, but it's going to take thoughtful policy decisions and courageous policy actors moving forward.
Can I just say one thing on that? Is when Miguel talks about silos, one of the things that got brought up recently, which in DART's defense, was a lot of businesses will go in, they will buy land, they will build a building that serves thousands and thousands of people a year, and then the business will come back to DART and will say, well, we just went through the whole economic development process with the city, and now will you put a bus stop in front of our building? Whereas, back to the silo, if in economic development, if in the actual plans that a developer, that someone has to go through, if there was even a checkbox where they actually had to have some discussion with DART, or had to actually see where the closest bus station is, rather than this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to build it, and then a year later, I'm going to come back and put the blame back onto DART that, well, you don't provide service here. Well, you were never asked. And so I think that goes too of how do you start to collapse all of these different systems, and especially as you're doing community development, how do you actually start to intermingle all of them?
Miguel, you mentioned the sins of the past. Some of my coworkers at the Texas Tribune this summer crunched just an insane amount of census data, looking at income, poverty, housing costs, and once they did that and started charting things, it became like abundantly clear that communities of color, these are zip codes where a majority of residents are people of color, are way more likely to be cost burdened when it comes to housing, to pay above that 30% threshold than communities that are made up of majority white residents. It's hard to argue that that's not an effect of redlining, of government subsidized segregation, of racist deed restrictions from the 20th century. It's pretty clear what caused this. How do you undo that after just decades and decades and generations of holding people down? How do you undo that so that everybody can climb up the socioeconomic ladder?
Well, again, first, it's going to take courageous actors, and that's not just the elected officials who are having to make some of these decisions, but that means community leaders as well, continuing to make this an issue. But you said something, Brandon, and I'm glad that you highlighted a lot of those man-made policy decisions. Federal redlining, that was a decision, a cognizant decision people made to completely write off African American and Hispanic communities from ever getting the loans that they would need to be able to get the house that would allow them the opportunity to build wealth, right? Exclusionary zoning, both racial exclusionary zoning, and then once that was found to be unconstitutional, other creative ways to do exclusionary zoning, and so on and so forth. We talk about these things like everybody knows it. Not everybody knows it. Like, we kind of know there were some racist things that went on back then, right? But these things are not specifically talked about. So the first way towards healing and towards ensuring that everyone has a shot is to make sure that we are very clear about the man-made decisions that socially engineered us to the problem that we're at today, and the compounding moral effects and the compounding inequities that have existed still to this day. Then we say, okay, let's be bold and let's put forth a comprehensive housing policy that begins to start to identify solutions to some of these issues. Now, I am certainly not saying that the current housing policy is going to help us reach true integration and true desegregation from the past, but it's a step in the right direction, which is why we need to ensure that it is followed and not tweaked significantly, at least. We're right at the beginning of when this policy was passed, and there's already attempts to try to kind of go back on some certain things that would lead us to the ultimate goal that we want to go to. And then we ensure that we get rid of all these silos and have these institutions talking to each other about what other policies from a regional standpoint we can put in place to demystify the process first of what got us to this point, and then also ensure that we solve the problem.
To add on to that, today, the average net worth of a black family in Dallas, Texas is $6,000. A white family is $190,000. In 1960, it was closer together. What happened? We've not done a good job of helping and writing policy and incentivizing the right things. If you're wealthy and you know how to work the system and go through all the city hall and all the banks and all that stuff, you can get lots of free money and you can go do things. The incentives are in the wrong place. The incentives should be and mentoring and training and cheap money for people in the South. It would fix this city in no time. It's about the money. Money is good if it's used in the right way, and we're not using it in the right way. If we have the money, we have the will to build a deck park over a freeway, we surely ought to be able to train some people how to own real estate, how to start their own businesses in South Dallas.
I'm trying to figure, I think I only got like one question left, so I'm trying to figure out like what I want to. Another thing that we found was that renters are way more likely to be cost burdened than homeowners. And if you kind of think that through, that leaves renters with less money for, you know, groceries, transportation, daycare, things like that. But it also leaves them with less money to save up to buy a house, and which has been brought up several times tonight, is that's how you build wealth. Do y'all kind of see it as, in a way, that in Texas, renters are stuck in this cycle that they will never get out of? And what can be done to get them into homes that they own?
It absolutely is. And again, I talked about this right at the beginning, this idea of reurbanization. Well, we're basically convincing a whole bunch of people to move to these urban cores on the fact that they are going to be able to make it, and they'll be able to find something affordable for them as well. So we're really creating, there are two major affordable housing issues that we're facing. The affordable housing issues of our communities who have been written off because of these policies and other things, and then affordability for people that are coming in that feel like they're going to be able to make it and are about to be hit with reality. So there are a couple things that I think that we can do. I mean, one major thing is ensure for the individuals that never had the shot to build up the wealth, to break out of the cycle of rent and pass that on to the next generation and the next generation, create ways that, and I'm going to say it, engineer ways that allow them to build that wealth. There are things like land trusts. There are things like community land banks where organizations, a lot of times it's nonprofit organizations, can literally buy up land in some of this developing area, and they can plop a house or houses down there and say, we're only going to sell this to people who don't have access right now to this type of a home, and we're going to make sure that we put caps on any interest that they would need to pay. So they basically structure a way for you to begin to build wealth, and then after a certain point, when that wealth's built, you go on, you get the house that you ultimately wanted, and then another family will come in and do the same thing. Is that a systemic reform? Not necessarily, but it is something that we can put in place through policy that would allow us the opportunity to begin to chip away at some of these critical issues.
I can give you an engineered way, and let me give you one example. And one person, and it's one person at a time, it's doing this. So when I owned the Belmont Hotel, I had a housekeeper that was started off making $8 an hour, and she got her way up to $12 an hour. That's not enough money to raise a family. And I hated it because the most important person in a hotel is the housekeeper, and that's the worst, they get the worst pay. What's wrong with this system? And so when I left the when I sold the hotel and I left, she said, I want to go with you. And I said, well, you can go with me, but you can't go with me as an employee. I'm going to set you up in your business. You're going to have a cleaning business now. And so when she cleans my apartment now, she takes her an hour and a half. She gets $50 to clean the apartment. So by being in her own business, her wage nearly tripled. And so by showing her and teaching her that one thing, and now today, right today, in fact, she closes tomorrow, she's buying her a house with no help from anyone but herself. She made enough money. I mean, that's all we got to do is engineer a way where people can have a way that they can do it for themselves, their self-esteem, everything about her. This lady, you can't even believe this lady from where I first met her and what she's like today. And I didn't do it, she did it.
I think that we sometimes don't give the option of renting as much credit as it might deserve, because sometimes that's just going to have to be what it is. And recently, so I talked about Mayor's Rising Star Council either. After 3 years, we decided to add a North Dallas High School because we thought we've got to stop talking about racism and segregation just in our silo with Southern Dallas kids. We need to start having the conversation in North Dallas as well. So one of the kids who came out of that, her name is Barbara. And Barbara recently, her father is absent from the picture. She watched her mother commit suicide when she was a young kid. She's now being raised by her 26-year-old sister, who it's Barbara and several siblings, and they live up in Richardson ISD area, still the city of Dallas, but Richardson ISD, and they lived in what was called a high opportunity area. And so she had access to a great school, she had access to a great amenities, they were renters there. Well, then there's now a great development there. Now is a grocery store, and there's a Starbucks there, and there's housing that's been built there. And in a meeting recently, Barbara came up to me and said, just so you know, that development is really great, but now my family and I don't live there anymore. And she and her family are now living at the corner of Forest and Aldelia, which, if you know anything about, is one of the highest crime areas in the city. So now one of our own kids that we have mentored for several years is now needing to rent. She was in a high opportunity area. She ended up being outside of her attendance boundary of the high school she was going to and was going to have to go to a different one. Very quickly of even how we are building, and we're building some great affordable units, but now we've just displaced even those who she could have been, and she still will be. But she could have been the change in her generation to be a renter in a high opportunity area, to be the next in her family to create wealth that would have changed the scape for them. But that was taken from her and her family because of how some developments recently happened.
I know we're coming to a close, at least on this portion. So one of the other things that I would highlight, and this is something that is, when you hear the stories about this, it's just horrendous that this goes on in today's day and age. But the housing tax, the housing voucher discrimination that particularly communities of color still face to this day. They work, you know, to fill out all the paperwork, and they're on this waiting list, and then eventually, if they stay, you know, on it long enough, they can get this voucher, and then the second that they go to try to use this voucher, that would allow them the opportunity to save a little bit more money, have a nice place to be able to stay at, and continue to help work on building their wealth, they go and they show up, and these people are denied. Time after time after time after time for no good reason. No good reason.
Well, except for the state allows them to be discriminated against.
Except for the state allows them.
Texas is one of two states, I believe.
One of two states. Except for the state allows people to do this. This is a huge thing that can change if we see this happen, a change happen at the state level. Now, I'm not saying that vouchers are going to be able to solve this much broader conundrum that we face. Don't get me wrong, it is not a panacea, but at the very least, we should allow a program to work to its fullest fidelity. And there are ways that we can do that, starting with legislation and courageous leaders that are willing to tackle this head on.
Awesome, thank you. I have like 20 more questions for y'all, but we have to share. So I do want to open it up to the audience. If you have questions for any of the panelists, you can, if you want to just come up, we have a microphone right here. And if you just want to, you know, it's okay if you want to set your question up, but if you'll please quickly get to the question and not just make a long-winded statement.
Thank you for clarifying. My name is Edgar. So my question is related to the conversation of silos. So this conversation of affordable housing in silos, how do we couple that and address affordable housing with it being an international issue? Primarily with an issue that's hitting home here, specifically in Texas, humanitarian issue of asylum seekers coming to Texas, or to Dallas specifically. We felt that push from asylum seeker children from Central America coming to the U.S. and Texas. So how do we deal with and work through the ebbs and flows of affordable housing and trying to deal with immigration?
So easy questions first, right? So I would first say that Dallas is a welcoming home for immigrant communities and for refugee communities particularly. We have hyper concentrations of refugees right now in specific neighborhoods around our community, and you know, they're going to be here for some time. And so if there are ways that we might be able to help our refugee community, we should certainly do that. But on the bigger issue, I think I'm not quite sure that we can teach the international community anything right now, because I think we need to still figure out what we are attempting to to do. But as far as silos are concerned, here's one unique way that Dallas ISD could work with the city to ensure that we have an expansion of affordable housing stock. We are one of the largest owners of property, Dallas ISD, one of the largest owners of property across this entire county. And yet, when we go to offload these properties, we essentially just aim to try to make as much money as we possibly can off of the properties. Now, I would make the argument that yes, we have a fiduciary responsibility to taxpayers to ensure that we are getting a big bang for our buck. But we are also uniquely positioned to utilize these facilities to help some of our most entrenched societal issues. So I've tried to lead the effort a couple times and have come up just one vote short each time to ensure that these properties first go to a conversation with the city to figure out if there are ways that we can create affordable units through these things. I haven't made the complete case, I think, effectively yet, so I'm getting to it, but that's one element of how we can de-silo by creatively thinking about the ways that we offload properties as government institutions.
I would bet that there's some city staff who have looked at the numbers of units that have to be built over the next 2 years and would agree with you.
Corruption keeps us from doing really good stuff a lot.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I want to move on to a topic I don't think we addressed. So my wife, who couldn't be here today, is a social worker, and she's worked in nursing homes, she's worked in hospitals, she worked in Big Baylor, she dealt with the population in the South Dallas, she's worked in population in Garland, so it's not necessarily high income. Now she works for a large insurance company, and she works at home, and she's on the phone every day with cases, and she deals with how do you deal with Medicare and Medicaid and so on. She tells me not a day goes by which a senior doesn't discriminate by race or ethnicity has a housing problem. A day doesn't go by. In fact, very often, it touches on something you guys said, where some investor buys property and then rents go up, and then the senior who's now on fixed income has to be moved out. And so she hears this every day, and it doesn't matter, what your background was, what your skin color was. And so we have this population. If you look at the demographics of the U.S. and the way that baby boomers are aging, it's put two and two together, and we're running into a housing crisis of affordability for our seniors who may not necessarily be able to afford housing. So I just wanted to throw that out there and have you guys comment on it.
Are y'all seeing, especially with the aging baby boomer population, people who have been working, their whole lives, and maybe who, have, did the right thing, saved up, bought a house, owned the house for decades, now being pushed out of it because they are on fixed incomes and, that are not keeping pace with, inflation, rising cost of living?
Yeah, if taking a purely educational lens on this, and another issue from a state and a federal standpoint that people are dealing with or not dealing with is teacher pensions. So we've got teachers who have worked their entire lives believing that their retirement funds were going to keep up with cost of living and so on and so forth, who are intending on retiring and continuing to live in this community. And unfortunately, the way that the development's going, that may not be able to be the case. So it brings me to the idea that a lot of the people that we rely the most on to deliver on public goods, like teachers, police officers, firefighters, nurses, and so on and so forth, they themselves are getting priced out of our community as well. And again, going back to this concept of reurbanization, they are being replaced by millennials and apartments who themselves, in a couple of years, are going to find the same problem. So we have to be really serious about being conscious of the policies we're putting in place to ensure affordability is good for everyone, and not just the traditional way we think about affordability or some sexy affordability policy we want to put in place that's only going to help those people that are, from a higher wealth standpoint.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to say thank you for having this discussion. We've needed it for many years all across the state, and it's across the country. One of the major issues is taxes. And right now, the school board has approved the TRE, the tax ratification election. 22.9% of the city of Dallas has an income of $25,000 or less. And the income, the revenues to the school district for the first year are projected to be $119 million. The amount that goes to the state is $65 million. Over 5 years, the amount that goes to the state of Texas is $1.3 billion, according to the research that DISD put out itself. When we tax people more, we're putting a lot of pressure on those low-income people who either own their own homes and have inherited their homes from their grandparents and parents and so forth. But the main thing is it is going to be a tax burden on so many people. The census quick facts says the median income, I've seen 2 different figures, $55,000. So when you have additional taxes on people with low income, you are creating more homeless people. So if you would talk to that a little bit more, but you have to remember that when those taxes go to Austin, you think, oh, great, we're helping other school districts. But the district's money, or the state or the city's property taxes go to Austin, and that money is put into general revenues, and the state takes out its money that's been appropriated for education. So we've got to follow the money, and you've got to think responsibly about how you vote on.
Do you have a
TRE.
question? Sorry to interrupt you, but
what I asked is for a little bit more discussion about taxes, and it's a combination of school taxes, county taxes, hospital taxes, and we need these services. But how can we pay them? And the state has
the state actually is. I mean, last session, and it's probably going to come up again. You know, there is going to be a battle over, you know, setting a cap on what local governments can collect, and how in the fight last session, and will probably be this session, and I think is what you're getting at, is that, you know, there's this push and pull between having to provide services, whether you're a school district, a hospital district, a city, and you know, charging people so much money that, you know, they can't afford to live where they are. You know, as a school trustee, how do you balance that?
But the main thing to remember is the state apportionment has been up to 55%. And right now they are paying 38% of the local school costs.
I'm looking forward to your advocacy in Austin in a couple of months. And I wish it were that easy to say, you know, school districts, don't ask your voters for a tax increase because, you know, there will be a fix somewhere else. That's just not what's happened. The empirical evidence that I've been able to gather suggests that it won't happen. And unfortunately, the one thing, separate and aside from housing that's affordable and your ability to be able to build wealth through housing, that allows you, and probably the most impactful thing that allows you to break out of poverty, is what? Education. So we've been placed as a school district in a really difficult position in which our only ability to adequately and equitably fund a holistic education that will ensure that not only kids can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but gives them freaking boots to begin with. That's our only ability, is to hope the state is a good actor, which they haven't been, or to ask taxpayers to support us a little more. Now, we believe on this particular proposition, and I promise you I will not go too much further on this, on propositions A through D, that if we're able to inject a little bit more capital into programs that are working, that we have targeted as working effectively, that we'll be able to shift the futures of hundreds of thousands of kids pretty quickly. And we've got the evidence to suggest we're going to be able to make that promise and deliver on it. In 2009, when I came to DISD, of the 230 schools, 89 were improvement required. This past year that we just finished, 4. And these schools aren't just coming off the improvement required list. These kids are on a path to true college or career readiness. Now, it's a shame that taxpayers are having to even consider thinking about giving us a little bit more. It's also a bigger shame that the state, year after year after year, is derelict on its duty of ensuring that we have adequate and equitable funding for our school system, and so it needs to change. Join me in Austin this session as we make this an issue.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my question is, how does the Opportunity Zone investment capital gains tax incentive, that little thing that President Trump put into that new tax bill, how is that going to factor into this improvement for affordable housing?
So I don't know if any of you have seen the Opportunity Zone map for the city of Dallas.
It's a red line.
It's terrifying. It goes to my original comments of there are tools that have been put in the toolbox, but if they are not deployed properly, we are going to do the same thing that we have been doing for decades and decades and decades. And so while I think there is opportunity in those opportunity zones, it's just a different name, and I am very, very cautious about what the opportunity zones are going to do. Specifically, if you have not seen the map, the swath of them, there is one that I think it's 4 different census blocks that are 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, it could be a great opportunity, but I am being cautious about that.
This has to be our last question, but yes, go ahead.
Hi, I work with a nonprofit group called the Texas Tenants Union and work daily with people who are facing eviction, being priced out of their apartments, being displaced from their communities by this new development. And I'm not a big fan of the city's comprehensive housing policy. I found it appalling that most of the resources are for home ownership rather than rental, and most are for market rate and luxury housing as opposed to where the greatest need is. What I'm wondering is, how do you reconcile, BC Workshop is a group here that did a State of the Housing report that found there's 68,000 households in Dallas that can't afford to pay more than $400 in housing costs, and that rang very true to me. So this market value analysis that they paid God knows how much for, they came up with these 20,000 units. I'm wondering if there's an explanation or if you all can reconcile that.
Well, again, so I'm glad that you brought up that exact point, and this is one of the things that I want to make explicit now. When we say there's a lot left to be desired on this housing policy, it's that. In my opinion, when I go back to those 2 sets of affordability conundrums that we face, the comprehensive housing policy is doing a pretty good job of highlighting the affordability issue of those who are already making a good, good day's work from a salary standpoint, right? We just want to make sure that they have a little bit more affordability. What I feel like we may be leaving behind are those communities who have always been left behind. And so we need to make sure that we are looking at an AMI standpoint and making sure that developments are actually encouraging good, or monies are encouraging good development for our communities that you've already highlighted. And secondly, and this goes back to the silo issue, there are other municipal institutions that have a role to play here. Dallas ISD just recently had to go through work with the tenants union because we were pushing kids out of rental units, getting rid of their units to put a school right on top of those units. That's not the best approach if we're going to be a good partner to the city moving forward.
I was just going to say, the city, one of the things that they are doing really well in this process is they're trying to do the best that they absolutely can in hearing from folks like you. They have convened a housing policy task force, and it has several different subcommittees that do meet regularly. I think Romeo, who is one of the sponsors, is one of the co-chairs of one of the subcommittees. But I would highly encourage, it may be an action item for y'all, if there is an area of interest, and if you see parts that are being picked apart, there is city staff who is asking where, how, what do we need to adjust that need voices like yours.
Yeah, been doing it for decades.
Yeah.
Down in Bonton right now, I helped them design what's called the roommate house, and it's a house that's going to be sold to an ex-homeless person. He's going to own the house with 2 roommate suites connected to the house, and so he's got the loan at 2% interest 2%. And now he can take in income from these 2 roommates. Okay, so these are homeless people that moved out of a shelter into their own room. And baby boomers could do the same thing, that are aging baby boomers that have bigger houses. If they could be allowed to cut some roommates into the side of their house and keep part of their house, then they can make enough income to pay the taxes. So I think we're still thinking about the wrong things. We're thinking the same way. We have to think about, the taxes are always going to go up. Gentrification is always going to happen. It's going to happen. You've got to figure out a different model to deal with it. And it's going to be dealt with wealth and income, not with trying to hold things down and force the government, force things on people. It doesn't work. The solutions that we're working on don't have any government involvement.
I was just going to, the only other thing is from a government standpoint, there's another issue that we need to address that I didn't bring up, and I think is something that needs to be highlighted, and that is homeless youth. We are seeing an increase in homeless youth. In Dallas ISD alone, I believe there's 3,000 to 4,000 students that we've identified as homeless. They're living either in cars or on couches of friends. We've created a program called After 8 to Educate. Well, we didn't create the program. There's an organization called After 8 to Educate that has emerged. It's a combination of work from the philanthropic community, the nonprofit community, and certain elements of the business community that have said we want to address this creatively through institutions like DISD. So some of these properties that I said that we're going to sell to the highest bidder, instead now we're working with organizations like After 8 to Educate. George Valdor has been a part of this and been really a leader in putting the funds there to make sure homeless kids have beds in these facilities.
This is really funny because we're currently buying a property that used to be a DISD alternative school on South Beckley that was sold in the free market. We're buying it from the free market and putting in 40 individual rooms for juvenile delinquency from 13 to 18 years old. So that's really funny because it came out of the DISD into the private market and then back in to this market. And there is a lot of meeting with city officials and juvenile, from the juvenile system and the CPS system, there's a lot of funds available to help house these kids. Because the problem is if we don't get them housing, they will go into the prison system. It's like a 90-something% chance that they will go into the prison system. So we've got to spend the money to get them housing right now. It's cheaper.
I would love to let y'all ask questions. I do have to stop right now. But speaking of solutions, we are about to break up into roundtable groups to discuss not only issues that are, creating unaffordability, but also what solutions there are, what solutions our policymakers should be pursuing. If you RSVP'd for one of the roundtables, you can check in the back. If you did not RSVP, please stay, please join us. We do want to hear from you and hear your ideas. But with that, though, I would like to thank our panelists so very much for coming tonight, and thank y'all also for coming.